This is Dr. Erin Smith. And Erin, I'm delighted that you could join us here today. Say hello to us all.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Smith. Do you want me to introduce myself? I'm happy.
No, I'm going to ask the questions here. Yeah, we'll do it carefully. But we wanted to see your face to see who you are. So let's start from the beginning here. I see you're in California. Are you a native Californian?
Yes, born and raised.
No, you
when I was applying
left.
to graduate school, my husband made the requirement that he was all on board. He was on board with my academic route, but we need to stay Southwestern United States.
My.
Although now he's talking about wanting to move, but that's never going to happen.
Never. Just within that little particular region then. Yeah. Okay. So that must be why you decided to do your undergrad at Point Loma?
Yes, there's many good reasons to do an undergraduate degree at Point Loma Nazarene University. Proximity to the beach is only one.
Really? Oh, I'm glad there are more reasons than that. Yeah. Yes, I remember the annual meeting we had there. It was 2012, I think. Yeah, it was great. Yeah, I think you may have left at that point. Yeah. So where did you do your graduate work?
My master's and PhD are from the University of California, Riverside, where I studied developmental psychology.
Mm-hmm. So what made you get into psychology?
So when I was an undergraduate, I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I thought that the first psychology class that I took for general ed was really interesting. So I picked it as a major and had no intention of doing anything beyond an undergraduate degree. Some of my students who know me well are shocked to find out that as an undergraduate, I intended just to go get a job at like Enterprise Rent-A-Car. That I don't know what it was about. That was in my head because when I would go to online job boards, which were kind of new at the time, they always seemed to be hiring, and I thought I could get a job and just move on with my life. But I had a psychology faculty member who kind of took me aside and said, "Have you thought about graduate school?" And I looked at him dumbfounded because no one in my family has ever done that, and thought, "No, should I?" And he said, yes, you should. And so I did, and God continually opened kind of one door at a time for me. And so I just kept following things that interested in me and ended up in graduate school, first studying how children learn from media. And then through kind of a series of events and grant opportunities, shifted to study children's developing religious cognition.
Wow, that's that's a significant message to all of you professors out there. You do have a key opportunity and a responsibility here to help people out. Yeah, it's quite a story. Yeah. So you got your degree, and did you get to Cal Baptist right away? Is that where you started your career then?
Yes, I've been at CBU since 2011. But my interest, it's interesting, since being here at CBU, I had a wonderful opportunity in 2015 to take part of the Bridging Two Cultures program funded through the CCCU and SCIO, Scholarship on Christianity in Oxford, which is like the UK branch of the CCCU, the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities. Mm-hmm. And so for 2 summers, my family and I were out in Oxford engaging in these interdisciplinary conversations around science and religion. And those conversations and the opportunity to learn from some of the preeminent scholars in the field really shaped my understanding that I wasn't just studying kind of religion as it exists in people's heads, although I do study that, and I think it's a really interesting academic question. But there are some really important conversations that happen that matter in people's lived experiences, that matter in our lives at this intersection of science and Christian faith. And then for me as a psychologist, thinking about the layers, both what are the psychological questions that happen at that intersection, but then also as people, we bring experiences and, previous knowledge and other, I'm going to call it baggage, into these experiences that are going to influence how we even engage with the information at that intersection. Right.
Very important. And which brings me to ask a little bit about, if you're willing to share, your faith background. I mean, how did the religion part come in? You told us that you begrudgingly went from your dream of an enterprise employee to psychology PhD. But what about the faith component? Where did the religion come in? Or was that part of your early days of growing up, or is that relatively late as well?
So I was raised in a Christian home, and for as long as I know, have had kind of this wonderful example in my parents. I mean, to the point where I remember as a college student having kind of a hard time and having a phone conversation with my dad, and he quoted Romans without telling me he was quoting Romans. And I just wrote what he said on a Post-it and attributed it to my dad because I had no idea he was quoting scripture. It just came so naturally out of who he was. It wasn't until actually after he died that I realized he'd been quoting scripture to me as this deep source of encouragement. So I've definitely grown up as a Christian in I've attended various denominations, mostly evangelical denominations. As a college student, I had what I wouldn't consider any kind of meaningful relationship with God. I was not anti-God. I was just busy and didn't really see the function of kind of an active, lived relationship with God. But then when I moved into graduate school, joined a church body where I actually saw for the first time really at a church level what I would call authentic Christianity. And I had experiences in small groups with confession and some of these like deep Christian traditions that I thought only existed in, Acts in the Bible. Like I didn't think that was actually what happened.
Yeah, right.
And actually my experience in that church is partly why we stayed in Southern California, because finding when I was on the job market, it wasn't just about what job could I pursue, but also what kind of faith community would I have to step into. And so the conversations were, would we still be able to attend this church? What kind of community would it be? So it ended up going from kind of back burner to the lens through which all questions that I asked that my family was asking was kind of filtered through is what does this mean for who we are as Christians and what it means to be in a body of believers.
Right. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, just before we give you a chance to summarize this article, could you give us just a little sense of how did you come to writing this article in the first place? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about how you got into the general field, but what stimulated this particular article? I mean, it looks like it may have taken you a little more than a week to do, right?
Yeah, I've been told it takes a while to read. So my apologies if some of you are still working through that off camera. This article I actually wrote as a result of a sabbatical that I was fortunate enough to be granted by CBU fall of 2019. I'd had kind of the idea of writing it for a while, but sabbatical actually gave me a chance to kind of sit down and do all the reading that I knew I would need to. I've been, as a graduate student, because that change in my kind of understanding of the importance of a relationship with Christ as being central to who I was as a person, not that I was a Christian and that I did science, but that I was a Christian engaging in science. That shift happened over graduate school and then was magnified as a result of that bridging two cultures experience. And so I've been asking questions about why do we see science and Christian faith or even religion more broadly as at odds? What gives with this conflict thesis, which all the historical evidence says is much more complicated than we might want to believe. And there's not a lot of good evidence for it. But why do these perceptions exist such that Christians are underrepresented in science, especially elite levels of natural science? And I've also been interested in how do we as Christians, I'm going to put this in bunny ears, change the world, right? How does change happen? How does cultural change happen? And I think these are really important questions that there's lots of different answers to. But I read a book by James Hunter Davidson a while ago, just kind of before my sabbatical. And one of the arguments he made is that change happens by engaging the cultural centers of power. And as I see it, science is one of those cultural centers of power. And so if we as Christians want to engage and shape culture, then we need to engage these cultural centers of power. It's not all kind of bottom up grassroots. That's surely a part of it, but it can't all be that. And so when Christians self-select or are disengaged from science, especially at these elite levels where we're forging culture, that has major implications for the presence of God in culture. It has implications for the Great Commission, right? To be disciples. It's not just about the 1040 window, but it's also about places where there's beakers and lab coats. How can we bring God into spaces in a meaningful way if Christians are absent from those spaces?
Yeah, and I'm sure in your experience and in many of us, and it was my own experience, when you grow up, you don't have that many role models. You don't have role models who went into science and explicitly the highest reverence or the most revered professions are those in full-time ministry work. That was just way above. Scientists, yeah, they were good to read about. That was always very interesting. But to be one, that was a little bit different. You didn't really know the path and where it went. So it's true. And of course, the data that I think all of you have seen is such that we're very significantly underrepresented in the scientific realm as Christians. So. Okay, with that, let's get into the article. We don't have a good way of giving an exam to everyone on here to know exactly how many read it, but that's beside the point. If you could just kind of give us a little short overview as to the key messages that you were trying to get across in this article.
Sure. So one of the things I've presented kind of various aspects of this project as I was starting to think through it at different ASA or CSCA meetings, and gotten some feedback from non-psychologists that really led me to understand that many people just don't have exposure to what psychologists take for granted. Kind of common knowledge in the discipline of psychology isn't common knowledge, right? And that makes sense because we are all experts in our own discipline. But it became clear to me that understanding how we engage with information is something that those of us who are interested in engaging in conversations that cross disciplines, we need to have a better understanding of. And so in the article, I outline first, I start with this kind of metaphor for understanding human reasoning, that there's these two systems. Now, in reality, it's more complicated than two systems, but that will suffice for the purposes that we need here. We have this system one, which is quick, automatic, intuitive, and system one takes care of the vast majority of the decisions we make throughout a day, to the point where we don't even really have to think about making the decision, right? You might have this kind of unconscious thought of, sure, I'd like some more coffee, and then your brain just executes it and makes it so, bringing that sweet goodness into your body. System two, on the other hand, is much more intentional, and it's much more algorithmic, where you might actually sit down and think, how much caffeine is good for my body to consume? And you're going to calculate it out and then make reasoned decisions based on available evidence about whether or not you should put that goodness into your body in this particular moment. And so we have these two systems of reasoning. And because system one is so prevalent, to help us deal with the incredible amount of information that kind of surrounds us at any one moment. So it's a system one is a good thing, but because we use it so easily, it also means that we can funnel and filter information through system one without realizing it, leading us to forms of motivated reasoning or biased reasoning. So we would all hope that when we engage with information, say, about some new scientific report, that we want to engage with it in a way that leads us to an accurate understanding of what that report is saying, so that we can take that information and do something with it. And that's a good hope. But the way that many of us engage with information, actually, I'm going to say the way that all of us engage with information, means that sometimes we will read, say, a new scientific report, funnel it through system one, through all of our pre-existing experiences, our biases, our desires, our wants, in a way that leads us to misinterpret or to come to a faulty conclusion about that data. A faulty conclusion that we are otherwise blind to. That's kind of the essence of motivated reasoning. When we engage with information in a way that channels us toward a desired end, even if we didn't sit down and think, how can I distort this news report today? But these processes happen unconsciously. And in the paper, I outlined 3 types of filters that are at play, especially when we're thinking about this kind of quick processing of information, which is how we engage with most information. So I talk about our worldviews and how our previous experiences can shape our worldviews about the way the world should work, right? What's the proper relation of things in reality, both people and groups and information, even like the hierarchy of what kind of information we should engage with and how. I talk about implicit bias as really kind of a type of more general cognitive bias, but an implicit bias is a more of a social cognitive bias about sorting people and things into groups that we can kind of unilaterally categorize as good or bad, trustworthy, not trustworthy, right? And we can kind of assign this kind of like broad strokes of like, what do I do with that? And I'm thinking especially about implicit biases, about what it means to be a scientist. And if we have these biases, that being a scientist makes you anti-religious, which is, I think, a cultural view that exists, then we are going to, if as a Christian, I think, well, why would I trust this scientist? They're just out to get my religion, right? They don't even see me. Well, that's going to change how I engage with what they have to say. Which I think leads quite nicely to the third element that I discussed in the paper, which is this idea of shared reality. So much of our world is not something that, like, I now, maybe Descartes and other philosophers might argue with what I'm about to say, but I know this paper is real because I can pick it up and touch it and look at it and see it. But that's not how much of the information in our world actually is disseminated. We have to trust things that we cannot easily verify. And so when we have this sense of shared reality, this kind of similar way of seeing the world, that makes otherwise a subjective experience real. So it turns this kind of unverifiable, subjective, I think that's the way it is, into that is the way it is. And so when there's this kind of constellation of biases such that we might perceive science a certain way or Christians a certain way, that might kind of move us toward or away from shared reality in a way that might either complement or conflict with different worldviews, that really sets up the stage for the possible distortion of evidence through motivated reasoning. And so that's really kind of the first part of the paper, but it's really meant to lay the groundwork for the suggestions that I give for how do we overcome that. But do you want me to pause at this point and ask if there's any questions, comments on that? Because I realize there is a lot of information in the paper and I've kind of just started swiping over some of the details.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Let's take it in 2 parts here because you're going to move on to ask. Becky, are you going to enable us to unmute if we can? Is that working? All right. So I think those are some very important pieces. If some of you would like to ask some questions directly, feel free to indicate that in chat or just unmute yourself and speak up here for a little bit. So I should say that this implicit bias concept, of course, I'm not biased, but I think all the rest of you are. We generally see bias easily in others, a little hard for us to see it in ourselves. Is there anything that we can do to help us recognize our own biases when you come to a topic of this kind?
it's a really good question. One that corporations are paying millions of dollars in attempts to address, right? And there's lots of mixed evidence about the effectiveness of things like implicit bias training. But I think my current read on the data really suggests that the best ways to help identify some of these biases are to engage system 2. That we have to stop and say, okay, let me look back at this interaction and step back and try to be honest and really evaluate in a way that's not just, oh, well, of course, that was the logical response that I would give. As a Christian, I would also say that community is really important in this. So one of the things that makes science a particularly powerful tool in trying to unpack reality is that it's not held in the head of one person, especially with movements toward open science, where I might have a data set and I'm going to analyze it and I'm going to interpret it and publish it, but then I'm also going to make the data available so that other people can come, and in this very public forum, we can kind of work together. So another research team and my research team might see the world very differently. And so we're going to look at this data set with all of our biases that we're bringing into it, right? I think about the theory ladenness of data. So we're going to bring those in. But over time, when we have multiple perspectives working on the same project, in theory, we're going to be able to kind of winnow out what is there and what have we brought into it.
Right.
What
So what you're really saying is that it takes a combination of system 1 and system 2, right? You can't do. And I think for myself, and I probably speak for a large majority in here, we're trained to think in system 2. Just the sheer data, and I at least am so. I'm so committed that system 2 is kind of the only way to show anything, and that's just natural, and that the only way to convince somebody is to show them more data and show them clearer logic, and yes, we will all come to agreement. Doesn't seem to work, does it?
No. And that's actually one of the, if you were going to take one take-home point from today and my paper, I think that would be it, that we are not neutral processors of data. And so if somebody disagrees with you, we are not going to convince them by just beating them over the head with more data.
Right.
Now, that does not mean, I want to be very clear, that does not mean that everybody's viewpoint is equal and that like everybody can hold their own truths and that data is just whatever. That it doesn't mean that, but it does mean that if you want to talk about data with somebody who disagrees with you, starting with more data and really trying to intellectually shame them into your perspective by just heaping more and more data isn't likely to be effective.
Right.
If the goal is to get them to engage honestly.
Very good. We've got a few questions in here. As much as possible, I'd like to have you ask them yourselves rather than my reading them. And the first is from Ken and Cheryl Turian. Good to see you guys over there. And you had a comment or question about storytelling. Would you mind asking that directly?
Mine is a comment to the author. I appreciated the way she did the system 1 and system 2. The first one being intuitive, the second one being more rational. But you should remember that all major or almost all major scientific breakthroughs come through intuition. They're initially based on the study system 2. You study the data, look at it, and you can't come to a conclusion. And then, bam, an aha comes. And you solve the problem. So there's an interesting link between those two, which have to be in mind.
I guess I'll go ahead and ask mine too. We really enjoyed this article. In fact, I made personal notes that I'm going to carry in my wallet. But the thing that I was struck with, I've studied a lot about storytelling. Of course, Jesus was a master storyteller, and telling stories, I'm sure Dr. Smith knows is an excellent way to undercut bias. And I've noticed, more and more, like in our media, they will maybe report on something or report on a policy, But what really moves people is they go out and find a story related to that policy. So stories are really important. And I guess that's one thing I didn't quite capture in the article is the relationship between what scientists would call anecdotal evidence and hard evidence, or as Dr. Smith says, threatening data. So that was my question, and that probably will come later in the discussion. It's not so much related to system 1 and 2, but just the role. Where does the role of storytelling come in terms of helping to remove or soften the acceptance of what's she called threatening data. So thank you. Excellent article.
Okay.
Thank you. I want to respond to those. Those are wonderful comments. I don't think system 1 is bad, right? We need system 1. One of the things that this kind of system 1 processing does is it makes us able to engage with things beyond what we are currently able, because it automatizes so much. So I think I have 3 young children, and my oldest is currently learning about multiplication, and it's really difficult for her in a way that it's not difficult for me. So I can do slightly more complicated math than my 7-year-old because I've automated so much of what she is currently using system 2 for. And so it's not that everything that comes out of system 1 is bad or perverse. It actually allows us to function, but it's some of those same processes that also allows us to distort. And so part of what I think our process should be, if we actually are people who are engaged, who are interested in being authentic and acting with integrity, is being willing to identify potential system 1 processes that might be distortions. But that doesn't mean, just because that willingness does not also preclude things like seeing a different way of solving a problem, because that's just how you've always done it. But in a new circumstance, that's one of those major aha moments. So I think that's a really good comment. And regarding storytelling, scientists need to do so much better at that. I didn't talk about it in the paper, but science communication, part of the breakdown in, I'm going to be so bold as to say, in our culture, in terms of bridging science to the non-scientific community, is the inability of scientists overall to communicate in a way that people understand. And that is through stories, and that is through examples, and that is through emotion. And it doesn't mean that we leverage those inconsistent with the data. But if I sat down with somebody and said, well, look, I have, a T-score, and look at my ANOVA, and look at this p-value, it's statistically significant. Their eyes are glazed over in a way that if I say, hey, I have this friend, or I had this experience, right? And this is what it means to me. I've engaged their system 1 in a way that actually might open their system 2, more analytical side, to better engage, because now we have that relational connection that reduces and helps mitigate potential psychological threat of whatever it is I'm actually trying to tell them.
Right. Right now, next we have a raised hand from, I don't know how to pronounce your name, Asawayam. Would you like to ask a question? Could you unmute yourself? Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah, still on implicit bias. I was watching a video of Ben Shapiro on, I think he was on a college campus answering a question on white supremacy. So for a moment, we could just suspend whether you agree with his political views or not. And he said there is no relationship between implicit bias and bias behavior, and that is why it isn't used in the courtroom. And he called implicit bias, he characterized it as a ghost of a ghost, because the person isn't aware that they have implicit bias. So how can they correct for it? That the best way, according to him, is to hold people accountable based on their actions and not based on what they are thinking in their heads, which they are probably unaware of. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think your question is really good, because the implicit bias literature, even though I've used it in this paper in the context of scientists and atheists, the way that or scientists and Christians, and then I have other ideas about the way that we create boundaries around different religious groups. That literature actually did start with biases around race and these more observable characteristics. I tried to communicate some of the nuance in the paper, that this is not, implicit bias is not something that everybody agrees on. Is that shocking to a group of scientists here? That there is a lot of, I think, really fruitful and productive conversations and research projects around implicit bias. There is some evidence that kind of suggests exactly what you said, that there doesn't seem to be a connection between the way somebody might score on an implicit associations test, which is one measure that can be inferred that can be used as an inference of implicit bias, that there's no relationship between that and behavior. But I think that there's other evidence that suggests it's a little more nuanced than that. So there is some evidence that we can spot, independent observers can look at individuals' interactions, say between white and Black individuals, and white individuals treat the Black individuals differently as rated by a completely independent observer in a way that can be predicted by their implicit bias scores, suggesting that there is a relationship. But that still doesn't get to, I think, what the crux of your question is what's the magnitude? And I think the general consensus is that at an individual level, the magnitude is likely very small. But when we zoom out and look at cultural or contextual levels, implicit bias seems to be really important. That it can serve as a thumbprint of a cultural view toward a group of individuals. One of the papers that I read that I was just kind of floored by was that if you look at, so the IAT, implicit associations test, you can Google it and take the test for free through the Harvard website if you want to kind of get a sense of what it's like. It's been taken by tons of people, and you can look at kind of where these individuals are located. You can look at the various differences at a group. So if you look down to a community level, you can see differences in kind of the average implicit biases of different groups. And you actually see differences in police use of lethal force as a function of the average IAT score for that community. So it's not any one person, but when a community has higher levels of implicit bias, say anti-Black bias, you see higher rates of police use of lethal force against African Americans in those groups. And so that's not, I don't think that we should interpret that as those police officers are racist or that community is racist, but I do think it says something about the way that culture views the nature of race relations. And I think that matters. And so when we zoom out and look at these more social kind of level variables, I think we can start to see that. The question about, so can we change it? How do we change it? I think those are really important questions. And I don't know the answers, but I think that as a Christian, I feel compelled to try.
Right. Okay. So we're getting wonderful questions along the chat, but probably more than we can handle. Before we continue with the questions, let's go back to you're finishing the article, the other part, which is getting into the application part.
Okay, thanks. So one of the things that I wanted to do was say, okay, so we have these biases, these filters that might lead us away from being able to just neutrally observe data and act accordingly, right? These human conditions. And so what can we do to better engage individuals with data, right? So if I talk to somebody who is a climate science denier. How do I engage in a way that doesn't fracture the relationship and that might over time allow us to better engage the data with more integrity, both the other person and myself, right? I don't want to make it sound like I have all the answers and everybody else needs to stop their motivated reasoning. As a side note, since publishing this paper, another paper was published that showed the individuals who are most aware of cognitive biases are also the most blind to their own biases, right? So you look at a group of psychologists who we can list the cognitive biases until we're blue in the face. And then you ask them, you give them tests of their own biases and they're more blind to them. So me as the author, that what I'm telling you is that I probably have more biases than the rest of you, partly because I'm aware. I don't know what to do with that yet, right? But I do want to make it clear that this is not, I am not trying to set up everybody else needs to deal with the data because I've got it right. Right. And I don't think that any of us should have that perspective, but rather be open-handed for honest conversation both ways. Yeah. And so one of the ways that I think we can facilitate more honest conversations is by reducing the psychological threat that people can experience. And so then we have to understand, where does psychological threat come from? Threats to self, right? Who I am, how I see myself, my history, as well as how I'm rooted in my groups. Humans are deeply social creatures, and we are defined, whether it be explicit or implicit, we are defined by the groups we belong to and that we perceive our belonging to. And so if we want to better engage data, I think that we need to create environments that say engaging this data and changing your mind doesn't change who you are as a person, and it doesn't change who you are in relationship. And so there's some really interesting empirical research on things like the affirmation of self, right? Understanding that I am more than my beliefs about evolution. I am more than my beliefs about the climate. I am more than any of these things. And when we recognize the multifacetedness of who we are, it makes us better able to change some of those things because who we are remains, right? Almost like a ship of Theseus, right? We've changed one of the planks, but the ship stands still. We also, another idea that I mentioned is emphasizing, I'll skip to the third one, expanding group identity. That having more examples of, okay, if I'm an evangelical Christian and all I see are evangelical Christians who believe this thing, right? The media tells me that evangelical Christians reject climate science. Well, then I guess I better do that too, because that's all that everybody in my circle does. But when I have an expanded view of what it means to be an evangelical Christian, I now have the freedom, psychologically speaking, to have diverse views because I can belong to different parts of this same group. And so expanding group identity, I think, is a really important part. Both we want to expand kind of our sense of self, but then also our sense of self and relationship. And then another thing, and I think this is especially important when we're having conversations, is emphasize value congruity. It's not just enough to say, put yourself in the shoes of this person, because if I put myself in the shoes of someone who I really don't like, it actually might make me more recalcitrant to changing my ideas. But if I put myself in the shoes of somebody who I believe is kind of like me, then I'm more open to ideas because we share values, right? That we have some of these kind of the foundations of our reality, this idea of shared reality is the same. And so really trying to think about these various elements that are at play to reduce the threat of information by expanding self, expanding group, and then also emphasizing value similarities, I think can produce more fruitful conversations.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, Erin, I see you in your article, you specifically talked about some applications to climate change and age of the earth. And given the timing as to when you must have written this and submitted it, you didn't have time to incorporate COVID-19 at all. And one of the questions here sent to me directly was, How would you apply this to some of the COVID-19 issues and trying to persuade people to wear masks or not, or to take it real, or to take their vaccines? Or there's so many issues where I think what you have to say here are much more relevant and pertinent than you thought when you wrote it.
Yeah, well, so this is where I'll give a small confession, I suppose. I was doing the revisions during the first lockdown, at least in California. But I intentionally chose not to enter that water. And maybe that was cowardly of me. But it's certainly not because it doesn't apply, but because I think doing the things I'm suggesting are really, really hard. And I'm saying that as somebody who I feel like I know I should be having these conversations. As I was talking with my husband last night, kind of thinking about this event and kind of processing with him, he said, he's not a psychologist. He said, so what are some of the questions that people might ask? And I said, well, chances are many of the people in the audience have been Googling things like, why don't people wear masks? And why is there so much resistance to vaccine, or even, whatever kind of where you are on that spectrum. And so some of what I'm saying it's already in our public discourse, but even then, in a group this size, there are likely people who are on both ends of the spectrum. Wear the mask, don't wear the mask, fight the mask wearer, don't fight the mask wearer, right? And so it ends up being really complicated, especially when you're talking to large groups of people. Just because it's complicated doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, right? And so I also want to acknowledge that. So as we think about how might you engage with, say, a family member who is adamantly anti-mask, I think what you don't do is you say, you're an idiot for not wearing a mask. You don't do that. That's not effective. You don't send them article after article about the data on the effectiveness in the context of COVID-19, because those aren't going to do anybody any favors. What it's going to do is raise their psychological defenses in a way that further entrenches them. But instead, if you open up conversations and say, tell me about your perspective. Why do you make these choices? And then intend to leave at least that very first conversation without letting your perspective ever come out. And some people might say, but if you don't ever speak that truth, how will they know? And I think that the psychological response is, if you speak the truth before it is ready to be heard, it's not going to be heard. And it's going to shut down future opportunities for conversations. Mm-hmm. And so I think if we want to engage with individuals who see the world very different than, I'm going to say, mainstream science, as Christians, I think we are called to hear them and to see them and to understand what the underpinning threats are so that we can engage in a way that is actually productive rather than kind of slamming them over the head with these realities.
Right.
It's really hard, especially in our current cultural climate, right? That's not the model that we have.
Right. That's very true. Let me just do a quick programming note before we go on. We're getting close to 3:00, though this program is nominally 1 hour, 2 to 3. We can close earlier if there are no questions. In this case, we have the other issue. We've got so many people. We will continue through the hour. We recognize some of you may have to leave, but in any case, we will stop at an hour and a half. We won't go longer than that if you're concerned about programming things. So given that, let's continue this discussion and encourage all of you participate. I see a long list of chats. Many of you can read them. Some of them are direct, some of them are to everyone. But so I can't do all of you, but Christy Albrecht, I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the psychological threats and your comment there. Would you mind talking about that, your question?
Yeah, I'm kind of reading through the lens of C.S. Lewis because I read a lot of things through the lens of C.S. Lewis. And so when I see these psychological threats, they mostly seem to be threats to our pride, to our sense of who we are, to our sense of what other people think of us. And so it seems to me that they feel like slightly dangerous suggestions because they are slightly indulging one sense of pride, but that amongst those who don't know Christ and Him crucified has to be our number one priority. And so we do have to make accommodations for that. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on extensions to using these suggestions amongst other Christians, because shouldn't we rather, among Christians, be encouraging them to quash their own pride, to have the humility to have our sense of self threatened, to discover when we are wrong? So I'm wondering, did you mean the suggestions to be with conversations to other Christians or just to those who do not know Christ? And if you would comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. Those are wonderful questions. I think that the suggestions are applicable kind of whoever it is you're speaking to, though I actually did write this specifically thinking about other Christians, in part because I believe that Christians have been called to a higher level of integrity. And that if we claim to have truth about the nature of reality that supersedes what we can measure in the natural world through Jesus, but then out of the other side of our mouths, we are spewing kind of, I'm going to say easily verified, but there's context there. But if we are spewing things that aren't even in good faith motivated reasoning, that makes it really difficult for our Christian witness. I'm not saying that we're always going to always agree, right? There's good productive disagreement between Christians about a lot of things in science and out of science. But they're only productive when we're willing to evaluate our own penchant for motivated reasoning. And so your question is, isn't that a little indulging of our pride and kind of this bolstering of self to say, well, you do that by, kind of bluffing that up in other people. But I'm not sure that that's actually problematic when that is a gateway to truth. That does what is the, I think that as Christians, the process matters as well as the product, but I'm not sure, or at least I'm not yet convinced that the process of seeing the image of God in someone else and recognizing their multifacetedness and expanding this sense of the group that you belong to, I'm not sure that is a process that should be avoided. I'm not sure that it's a sinful process or a prideful process, especially then when the product is also consistent with Christian integrity and saying, okay, now we are in a place where we have the kind of relationship where I'm not going to come after you with this bludgeon I call scientific data to beat you with. But rather we can have this conversation and say, hey, let's talk a little bit about truth, right? And let's talk a little bit about how you're representing and how I'm representing. And so if the gateway to that kind of openness happens through this affirmation of imago Dei in somebody else, I think that's for a Christian part of what it means to bolster a multifaceted sense of self, right? Recognizing that we are image bearers. I don't see any problem with that. If I've missed something in your question, please follow up, or I'd be happy to hear kind of your perspective as well.
I'm mostly thinking on the affirming self-worth. I definitely see agreeing on core values and diversity in Christian belief. Those, you have to be careful not to take them too far, but I definitely would agree those are very valuable. But when I was reading about the self-worth, I was calling to mind in Mere Christianity when Lewis talks about the temptation to appeal to pride to make people, to solve all sorts of other sins, and how pride is your worst sin, and you may be a liar and a drunk, but if you're not prideful, you're still doing better. Then that it isn't good to appeal to, I am a good person and therefore I don't do these things. And so that was my concern, that I feel like it may be appropriate with people who aren't Christians, but I'm not sure that at least I think has to be treated very carefully amongst Christians, to not be bolstering, I'm a Christian and therefore I'm good, and make sure that our picture of truth is still extremely important to us, and we know that without truth, we're nothing.
Right. Okay.
Can I just follow up real quick,
Sure.
Randy?
Sure.
Question.
No.
So I think that I think you're really onto something. The affirmation of self is different than this kind of like, if you've been around long enough, like the 1990s educational push, everybody gets a rhythm, you're all winners, everybody's first place. That's not grounded in truth, in reality. And so it actually is not helpful, and it backfires. The affirmation of self, I think, according to this literature, is saying, think about real experiences that you had where, think about things that are important to you. So what are your values? And then think of and remember times where you lived those values. And so what those values are might differ for people. So I think that there's actually some really important opportunities, though, again, these are empirical questions, important opportunities for Christians to say, well, my values are that I look a little bit more like the fruit of the Spirit, that I am more gentle, that I am more patient, that I am more joyful. And so maybe the affirmation of self-worth for me is thinking about times that by the grace of God and the goodness of the Holy Spirit, I have lived out these fruit. But your point still is well taken, that I don't want to say I've lived out these fruit by my own, awesomeness, because that is now crossing into prideful. And so thinking about what does it mean to be a self from a Christian perspective, I do think is important. So I appreciate your comment.
Yeah. Okay. So before we go to the next question, I want to highlight a few things that most of you may have read in the chat, but Jim Peterson points out the lead article in the next issue is vaccine hesitancy, which is fantastic. Thanks for alerting it, Jim. Who knows? Maybe we'll choose it for next time. Maybe not. We'll see what else is in there. But thanks for the heads up. And Janet, you got a book coming out here that deals with causation and COVID-19. That's super. We look forward to do that. Arnie, Arnie Berg, you had a question early on a little bit. Would you like to raise that now?
Yeah, well, while I have this opportunity, I just want to say how helpful I found this article. I come from a scientific perspective, and in the past, I've tended to, when I get into discussions with other Christians about differences that we have in our views, I tend to lean on the argument, well, what are you going to do with the evidence? And try and get them to see things from my perspective. But it's very good to get this background on the psychological impact that considering their perspective and their worldview and all these other the context of their lives and their experiences is extremely helpful. And I also found this article very readable. So many times when I read scientific articles, it seems like it's written in a foreign language, and I need to look up every second word to find out what it means. But in this case, I was just able to sail right through it, and it was extremely helpful, and I'm going to keep it on reference. But I ran into this one sentence that I kind of hit a cognitive wall here. And the sentence is, surely the range of intellectual abilities among the religious and non-religious are variable, yet they are not systematically varied according to religious belief. And I was wondering if you could just explain what that really means.
Yeah. So first, thank you for your kind words. I really appreciate that. That particular sentence. So I belong to a number of different kind of academic circles, and the ones where we study religion from a psychological perspective are always really interesting, because you have sometimes on one end a really dense population of religious believers, and then sometimes you have a really dense population of atheists who are just trying to understand why people believe in religion at all. And so it makes for really interesting conferences. But one of the things that has come out of these groups of literature is that, well, it's a very kind of Freudian idea, probably even predates Freud, is that people believe in religion because they're just not smart enough to engage with reality the way it really is. And so religion is both a psychological crutch that you need because you're just not that smart. And so there's actually some research that tries to address that question. And so that particular statement was kind of harking to that conversation happening in the literature, which really suggests that religious believers are not more dumb than non-religious believers, right? And saying this to a group of individuals attending from the ASA, I hope you don't take offense to the fact that that's even a question that's being asked. But I think I felt it important to include that religious believers and non-religious believers have various degrees of intellectual capacity, but those degrees of intellectual capacity do not sort people into religious and non-religious groups, that you have highly intellectually capable individuals that believe in religion and those who don't, and then individuals on the lower end of the intellectual capacity in both groups as well. And so you cannot reliably, from a statistical perspective, sort people into religious and non-religious groups based off of intelligence. And
I might add, it doesn't automatically sort into a degree of accepting scientific data. It's amazing the degree of intellectual ability that differs in terms of their scientific data. We've got Terry Gray with the raised hand here. Terry? Yeah, get you unmuted there. There we go.
Hello. Thanks, Randy, and thanks, Erin. When I was reading your article, my mind was drawn back to a 1980 article by Ari Legwater. I don't know if Ari's here today. There was something called Baku's iPad that I thought might be Ari, but good friend and mentor. And I've used this idea throughout my career in thinking about faith and science. But let me read this sentence. Creation doesn't matter is the title of the article. And he says it takes the Bible to tell us the truth with a capital T about the sun, that it is a servant of the Lord. The sun is not so much a matter of fact, an astronomical object with certain spatial dimensions, a particular angular momentum, luminosity, or elemental composition, but it is a minister for our good. And you know, I translated that in some of my classes with my grandmother, who understands that God made the sun and uses it for our good, knows more about the sun in a fundamental sense than the astronomer who has this expert knowledge. And it seems to me that might be a number one, number two way of breaking things down. But I think one of the things that Ari is emphasizing here, and you have to read the rest of the piece to get some of this, but that knowledge of God and His being Creator is the fundamental of reality. And while it doesn't come up in our scientific data analysis, the number two processing, it is absolutely fundamental to understanding reality and understanding truth with a capital T. And so I was hearing kind of echoes of that in your piece, and I'm still wrestling with whether I think you agree with it or disagree with it, or how you might nuance it. But what do you think of that idea? Is there a more fundamental knowledge of truth and reality that comes from our knowledge of God, and that He's the creator of all things, than anything we come up with in science and using empirical data?
So thank you for that question, and for picking one of the few things that I wrestle with on a daily basis. And so if you ask me that question today and then again tomorrow, you will likely get different answers, if I'm honest. Because I think it's a really important and difficult question, at least difficult for me, I'll say. I do believe that God is the foundation of knowledge and our understanding of reality. I think God is the foundation of reality, right? The thread that binds it together. But I have a lot of trouble engaging that in a practical way, because all of my understanding of God is filtered through the exact same psychological filters that I engage scientific data with. It is not that I have the penchant for motivated reasoning when it comes to engaging with science about vaccines, for example, but then suddenly I open the scripture and see things clearly. But rather, I take these same biases when I deal with truth as revealed by God to me as a human. I take those same biases to data. Now, we might argue that the data have a little bit more opportunity. I'm going to use the word corruption because I can't come up with anything better on the fly. That because they have been collected by people and then are being interpreted by people, that there's kind of more layers. But that doesn't mean that my understanding of revealed truth is somehow more accurate. There was a comment, a couple up in chat, about when we talk to other people about, like we want to bring them scientific data, it's really kind of assuming that we have the corner on reality. But I think that part of why these conversations are best in relationship rather than from some kind of, this is what you all need to believe, like 1 to thousands, is that it allows for the reciprocal response where productive dialogue can happen. Because what I think is true might actually be wrong. And so I need to be open-handed and humble about these things. It doesn't mean that I kind of all beliefs are equal. I have reasons for what I believe, but when in relationship there's conversation, I might actually change what I believe in hopes to move me closer to a better understanding of reality. So as I reflect on revealed truth through scripture and revealed truth from God, I think that's probably best if I don't do it alone, so that I have the opportunity to go to others in my Christian community and say, this is what I think, and they can speak and reflect back to me and say, yes, but look at this bias that you have. And let's think about how other people have thought about, can we expand the group, right? So you think this is what you have to believe about this aspect of theology, but do you? Is it actually more malleable, or is it small? Is the circle small? And I think those are important conversations, but I'm hesitant. I'm hesitant to fully agree, Terry, with what you've with that position, in part because it kind of assumes that we can look at revealed truth without these biases, and that's just not true, right? I don't believe that is consistent with how the human mind works, right? We look as through a dimly lit mirror, and there is smoke that obscures us, and the smoke can be more or less obscuring, but we will never, at least in this world, from my understanding, though I'm saying this with an open hand, have kind of an unfettered access to truth of any kind. That's,
okay.
I feel,
I think just to make clear, my grandmother may have faulty knowledge, faulty technical knowledge. I'm not saying that belief in God guarantees that our technical and scientific knowledge is correct. She may be quite wrong about all the details, or quite ignorant about all the details. But that fundamental piece that God exists, that God made the heavens and the earth, it has priority in one sense. And if we're calling that scheme one, then there's a sense in which then that has to take priority over scheme two in our personal understanding. How this works out in terms of a dialogue with an unbeliever or with other Christians is that's still a live question.
But would you call your grandmother's kind of rich and deep sense of the way the world works, given kind of her connection with God, would you really call that would you call that system one? I'm not sure I would, right? Because just because you might not have this technical sense, there's still, I think, a lot of wisdom comes out of this kind of deeply analytical investment that comes out of a system two type thinking. I also would venture that even if the technical kind of understanding of how the sun and how the sky and the cosmos works, if that is incorrect, but if somebody came and said, look at this data, she would say, yes, and now I can add that to my layers, right? Because there's different levels of analysis, levels that we can understand the universe, and scientific data is just one part. It is most certainly not kind of like the predominant or the most important part, but it is a part of the puzzle.
Oh yeah, very good. And I'm really glad to hear you say it that way. That knowledge of God and his relationship with the world may actually be part of our scheme two knowledge.
Okay, let's move on. I apologize. I had overlooked an earlier raised hand from Janet. I mentioned her book, but I should have given her a chance to comment. Janet, are you ready?
Unfortunately, the recording did not pick up Janet's audio for the question, so we will proceed directly to Erin's response.
No, that was great. Really, really important ideas that I think enrich this conversation. So thank you for sharing. You touched on the idea that individuals, that especially individuals who've had these kind of deeply spiritual experiences have difficulty sometimes recognizing that it's still mediated, meaning it's kind of filtered through our being, our minds, our brains, all of these normal physiological and psychological processes. I think I'm thinking about a colleague of mine who often bemoans the postmodern views of knowledge of many students these days. And I feel like I'm using his language as I say that. But one of the things that it taps onto is really the sense that what I've experienced is truth, that there's priority to my experience. And it takes, I think it's really difficult. And I'm saying this as someone who has experienced this. It's difficult to say, I have this experience, and it might have, physiological or psychological explanations. It doesn't mean that experience didn't happen, but it does make me have to nuance what the experience was. Not all thoughts that I have are true or real or helpful, but they might have happened. And so it requires us to slow down and really think about our kind of livedness. That feels so squishy to say, but I'm going to say it because our experience is surely a part that informs our understanding of the world and our experiences, but it also doesn't necessarily predominate or should necessarily take the back seat to other forms. This is, I think, consistent with what we were just talking about of putting various items that we can use to inform our understanding of the way the world works, including wisdom, Christian tradition, science, personal experience. Part of our job as people, I think, is to be able to put them into proper relation as we try to better understand kind of who we are in this world that God has given us. And what we are to do with that. So I think that's really important. And you talk a bit about fear. That's like the psychological threat. If we build these relationships, instead of just saying, why aren't you wearing your mask? Put your mask on. We can say, let's talk about kind of what is leading up to this decision so that we can deal with the real issue, because it might not actually be the mask. It might not be the vaccine. It might not be the age of the earth. It might be something entirely different. Like if I change this belief, then I don't feel like I belong in my church anymore. That's a big deal. And I think we can deal with that, not the age of the earth.
Right. Okay, so Jennifer Wiseman is hiding under the claim that she has no access to camera or microphone, but assuming she is telling the truth, I'll ask, she says, all this discussion seems to assume that we are correct when engaging fellow Christians sensitively. Now that can't apply to ASAers. I mean, we all are correct. Anyway, but what if they approach us with the exact same assumptions and approaches? Are we prepared to be on the receiving end of this and to potentially be wrong?
I hope so. I mean, I think that's a really good point, that if we engage in these conversations and we say, oh, look, now I have these psychological tools, I'm going to put them in my back pocket and everybody's going to agree with me at the end of the day, I think that misses the point of some of this, which is, what is the goal of your conversation? If your goal is to win, right, and to get somebody to agree with you, then I'm not sure that these are the right, well, if you want them to agree with you, maybe these are the right tools. But if you want to win, then you just go after them until they concede and say, fine, you do it your way, and they retreat in their corner and you guys don't talk anymore. But I think that if we are really saying that you feel compelled to have a conversation about truth and integrity in kind of whatever the domain is, that it should involve a lot of listening with an open posture. These are the reasons for what I believe, and I will give them to you, but only after you feel heard and seen, right? My pastor said many years ago that you can't shout somebody into salvation, right? And I think that we can't shame people into science by just flooding them with data. That if we really say, look, there's good reasons for what I believe, then we need to be able to engage open-handed, but then that also means that they should be able to speak into that open hand as well. And that we can then pause and evaluate and reflect and think, right? And this is partly why community is so important in this process as I see it. That's a really good question.
So I think we have time for one more short question. Ralph Rohr, were you raising your hand physically there? Or is that a misinterpretation? Okay, maybe.
I think I've unmuted it. Am I coming through?
Okay, yes, I hear you. Go ahead.
I just wanted to express a strong agreement with you, and you were addressing the subject of whether type 1 was the default way of receiving biblical information, and type 2 was the scientific way. I completely agree that biblical information requires the highest element of reasoning. I think anybody who thought it didn't would disagree with people like C.S. Lewis and Josh McDowell and Frank Morrison and others who have used a great deal of sophisticated reasoning to show not only the truthfulness, but the wisdom and the appropriateness of the biblical story. And Richard Simmons has recently written a book of essays about evidences for the existence of Christ, and he makes it very eloquently from a lot of different points of view, from atheists as well as from believers, that the Bible and the Christian story are really the only logical, rational account out there for the way God deals with the earth. So I'd recommend that book to you. And I do agree with you that high degree of reasoning ability and intellect is need to receive the Christian story. But by the same token, it doesn't take a lot of intellect or reasoning to accept Christ. And that's the majesty and the beauty of what God has done. He appeals to all of us. He doesn't have us singled out by categories. Thank you for your discussion today.
Thank you for those comments.
Okay, so we're coming right at 3:30. Erin, would you like to kind of just have a final word here in the final minute before we sign off?
Oh, that is a mighty task. The first thing I'll say is thank you. Thank you to everyone for reading the article, for engaging, for being here. I appreciate your comments and your questions. And I suppose I would just undertone that what I'm not saying is that truth is something that we can just kind of like everybody can have their own reality. The goal of my paper was to outline strategies to better engage individuals so that collectively we can all move closer to truth, leveraging various pieces of the puzzle of reality, of which scientific data contributes one part. And of course, I'm happy if any of you have other questions or comments. I'm always looking for better ways to communicate this information and new resources. And so I would definitely be open to those as well. I'll type my email in the chat and you guys are welcome to contact me that way.
Well, thank you. And I also like to say that although we need to stop this particular Zoom call, the discussion can and should continue. And that's why we do have a PSCF forum set up online. It's not used as actively as I would like, but maybe we could use that forum effectively to continue this discussion. And I would encourage any and all of you to go to that. It's under, don't we have it under the resources in our menu in the web page? It's somewhere in there, and I think it's also mentioned in the article, isn't it? Usually the PSCF issue itself has the URL to go to it. So at this point, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us and for an active discussion. And above all, Erin, I'd like to thank you very much for writing an outstanding article here that is helpful to many of us and stimulates a lot of thought. And thank you for taking the time here to share with us and to speak directly.